Hey, everybody.
Hey, everybody. Tyler, we're going to see Ethan from my lab joining. Can you make sure you give him all the co-host access?
Yeah, we'll do.
And while we're waiting, if people want to share anecdotes, thoughts, just like we do every time at the start of a class, before we jump into logistics and other things. Any questions people have on next week in terms of thinking about presentations? Anything that I can cover?
Maybe we can just do a quick recap of what the plan is for those in-person ones, and then just a bit about the deliverables.
Yeah, I was going to do the recap, but just before, because we're still waiting for people to come, I just want to take a few, any questions and clarifications, and then we'll do a recap once we sort of see the participation count normalize. And then, Tyler, if you could check if Ethan is already on the line or not. Otherwise, I'll ping him for a second.
Yeah, I'm not seeing him just yet.
Yeah. So the plan for today will be kind of the last formal class, and then we will transition into next week where we will do much more discussions with everybody in the class as presentations for specific projects. I think the idea would be is if people can share a quick set of videos beforehand, before people actually join the class, everybody else would have actually seen seen the videos. And of course, we would turn and transition that into conversations. And I think one of the threads that I want to mention is, of course, this class was a formal starting point for these sets of projects. This is in no way an ending point. We will continue a weekly meeting for anybody who wants to join for a little bit, very specifically on the projects that will be gathering momentum. We'll keep the Discord open as well. So nothing is going away in any way. The goal for us is to actually deliver on these projects. It'll just become more and more independent, that the teams become more and more stable. And at that same time, I'll continue to engage with all the teams, and especially to a point where we have certain sets of deliverables where we can actually launch these projects. So this is really a way to see, do we have teams passionate about executing in these domain spaces?
Absolutely. And on the Discord side too, as people start thinking, we're going towards the end of this like very official class thing. And I think definitely, continuing meetings will be awesome. And then also just on your guys' side, I'll be turning the Discord over to you to sort of own and build out as you see fit, and whether you're adding subgroups or continuing your teams or changing things up. I think starting to think about that and how you'll want to like build this community out is going to be super important. So we'll do some of those early meetings. We'll be thinking about how we want to frame that. So just to get your minds thinking about that already, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think the purpose would be is there is the broader side of the story, but more importantly, first, the goal would be is to be a little bit inward focused on the projects themselves. So the broader aspect is we're all here for each other, but more importantly, and today's class will primarily be about nurturing your team. There is a team that has come on board, and of course, many of you are working on very specific ideas that we're all excited about. But the most important thing to focus on in the next sets of steps is making sure that the teams directly, the sub-teams that are working on a common goal, are connected in a manner where we can structure these projects. So I think we'll have this discussion in the very end. But yeah, I think for people who just, rest assured that we're not going anywhere. Uh, it's a formal end of the class in any way, but that doesn't really mean much associated with. I think we have certain goals and projects in mind. Yeah, can you make Tyler Ethan the co-host? Yeah. Uh, so today's class, what I want to cover is something much more big picture, which is focused on how do we sustain projects and scale them up, especially from a perspective of when we are just starting to scratch onto the prototype side of the story to true projects where we can implement them. And then the discussion, we will also cover certain aspects. Again, this will be primarily a discussion around IP and the role of understanding. For some of you, you're very familiar with the kind of landscape of open source and open source hardware and other options. Some of you might be new to that field as well. We'll cover a lot of details on that front as well. And then in the very end, I also just want to cover what does it mean to sustain a project as well over the longer run. What does it take usually, with some sets of examples and discussions on transitioning these from just a specific class project to something that's meaningful and has anchors in places and communities that you actually care about. So this will be an informal discussion, and kind of with me joining will be Ethan Lee. Ethan is a graduate student in my lab who's championed a big portion of what we've been thinking about intellectually recently, which we are calling just open source medical device design, which I know some of you are thinking about from a medical space, but none of this will be completely focused on medical device. We've chosen that as a criteria of discussion, but you'll see much of that is applicable to all spaces. So I think maybe as a starting point, Ethan, I'm thinking I'll just first set the framework for why it's important to be thinking about sustainability of projects, and then we will drive and think a little bit about the technicalities of open source, and then we will broaden out to a broader question of how do you sustain your team? How do you figure out, and for some of you are in academic context, some of you are freelancers, some of you support yourself just by projects you do here and there. So I think this will really be all models open, but it would be valuable to just discuss the pros and cons of different models as well, specifically in the context of projects. So maybe, Ethan, do we first do a quick dive on the medical device framework briefly, or I think that would set a good groundwork for why open source is interesting, right? Yeah. So let me just share a couple of slides on this front briefly, and then we will transition to a discussion. And I'm trying to figure out present. So I think the framework we are choosing in this discussion is just briefly focusing on medical devices and the challenges that you've all heard. But again, I want to remind that this has nothing to really do with medical devices only. This sets of questions and challenges apply for a very broad range of challenges. And I think the big discussion Ethan and I have been having more recently is open source framework both compatible, and what do we need to bring to the table to meet the demands and needs in this perspective itself. And I'm just going to show you, I mean, of course, this has really been very clear to all of you all along the diagnostic side of the story. This became urgent to us when we started working on the ICU ventilator side of the story. there is a very broad range of medical devices. And of course, the reason I'm bringing up medical devices is that it's a lot more challenging, primarily because of the safety concerns. Same is true for diagnostics as well, where when humans are involved, there is a set of standards that have to be met. And the questions are, how do we, in a distributed, open manner, meet the kinds of safety standards to meet these requirements? And how do you sustain something like that? Uh, and I think this is a slide that Ethan put together that I really like. Ethan, do you want to talk through this numbers for a second? And then we'll transition into, go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, so medical devices are like very profitable, and you can see in the top half of the slide is kind of the most profitable countries that medical device companies make money from. And then the bottom half of the slide is kind of where those companies are based. So I think if you advance by one menu, then the bottom will show up. So like the companies are mostly getting their money from the US, from Europe, from Japan, and then less so from Canada and China. And then the biggest medical device companies are like based in the US and Europe, and 2 in Japan out of the top 30. So they're really designing solutions for where they are, as opposed to like for the whole world.
And I think this for us was, again, I think there are many ways of looking at this as a challenge. Ironically, although sets of solutions are built from where they're drawing their resources from, it doesn't imply that even in those places, many of these solutions are accessible and affordable to begin with. And then the skew of this is so dramatic that there has been a very classic trickle-down model, which is, again, Madhu described it as well. All of you are aware of that. Medical devices are first built in a given market, and say a high-income country market, and then there might be certain slowdown trickling that happens along. And financially, there is enough that has been put in place that then eventually what sets the end goal and end price, because it's perceived that the market for this technology or the need is so low, it's almost essentially operating backwards rather than designing for a given market, which is, again, all the sets of principles that we have been discussing so far, which is compiled in many of these forays that Kevin also talked about early on. So I think this is what I want to lead to in having discussions on sometimes hows and the whys of the cost associated with this, and where is the sets of challenges in the open source framework around medical devices. So the premise is that if there was communities like us that engage in building and designing solutions, and we make them openly available, that there might be a dent that we could make in this problem. But we have to test that premise. The premise has to be tested, and there are very few examples so far of, in the medical device space very specifically, in which open community-driven projects have been approved in some sense. Yeah, Ethan, maybe you want to talk about this data as well, which is the classic graveyard of medical devices.
Yeah, so most of the medical devices in low and middle income countries come either from donations from high income countries, some of which those like devices or the equipment is not necessarily appropriate for the different contexts that they end up being used in or donated to. And then other ways that these medical devices are produced in low and middle income countries is local production of designs coming from high income countries, or like low cost sale of these older generations of equipment from the high income countries. And so that's kind of the source. And then the usage, we see there's data that shows that like maybe about like 30 to 40% of medical equipment is just out of service in low and middle income countries. For many reasons, one of which is that like just the equipment is not appropriate, or there isn't the support to maintain that equipment over a long time.
And I think this is another aspect that when you start thinking about that, if solutions in healthcare, as a very specific point, were open, there is a hypothesis here that there would be capacity to service them at a higher rate. And then I think one of the things that Ethan and I have been looking at to see, is there data to support these types of ideas? And we kind of dawned upon it that there have not been, although there have been remarkable projects, but can we actually prove and confirm in a very data-driven strategy to see that, yes, this type of a strategy can actually sustain and produce safe products. So I think let's just briefly, Ethan, if you could walk through the flow of a traditional medical device and the kind of flow that we've been thinking about. And then we will transition into the IP side of the story.
Yeah, so kind of...
Do you want to share your screen, or I can also click?
Yeah, why don't you can click through it. So maybe if you just click twice, then we'll get to the full diagram. So the traditional like biodesign framework is before you like try to like push a medical device on somebody, first you have to identify a need. That's super important. And then you have to invent and develop a solution that meets the need, and then you implement the solution. But this is really hard to do for people who are trying to like design for low middle income countries or low resource settings from wealthier settings. Because it's very tempting that once something doesn't work, maybe the solution is inappropriate for low resource settings. It might still be appropriate for the more profitable, wealthier settings. And then so they just pivot away and focus on where they can make money. That's one area that's all kind of a challenge in the early stages of identifying the need or inventing and developing the solution. And then even if they make it past those initial hurdles, then there's like all of these other difficulties that come with trying to go from like one country to another country and getting technology transferred across. So there's like things about having relationships with local context, regulatory bodies and regulatory processes, figuring out manufacturing and distribution, all these logistical challenges, especially for low resource settings where innovators or designers or inventors in high-income countries and wealthier settings might not be so familiar with. And then there might also not be a good enough plan for supporting the equipment or the device, for training people to use it, for maintaining the stuff, and for like keeping up any supply chains, for example, of consumables or other things that are needed. And then so kind of all of these things have to be figured out before something can actually succeed.
And I think this is, I want to emphasize this, we wanted to discuss this more formally, primarily because if you heard in the tone of when Madhu was talking about it, he was talking about many of these ideas, that this is 90% of the effort. But often enough, when we start a project, we are not thinking about each one of these. We are thinking in a piecemeal manner early on. And of course, when something becomes very viable and formally accessible, then you can start putting pieces in place. And our realization on a few projects that we have been trying to build in the medical space on open source philosophy has taught us that each one of these sets of scenarios have to be thought about early on. And I'll mention for the two specific projects a little bit of how this framework has been helping in thinking about this from a deployment perspective. So yeah, maybe I think one of the threads we should do is just also mention the I guess the comparison. Yeah, Ethan, yeah, maybe this is the one.
So if you go ahead, this slide. So kind of the hypothesis that Manu and I were thinking about is like, what if we kind of have these design, invention, implementation processes happening in parallel between people in different settings with different access to resources, and have them kind of like working together from start to finish, instead of like somebody's working alone from the start and then they try to figure things out at the end of translating between the two. And so kind of this is kind of like the grand vision that we have not proven yet, but the hope is that maybe we can kind of get better designs, better research and development, better production or faster production, and like a smoother process through the regulatory approvals for medical devices if kind of people are working together from the start.
Yeah, and I think I'll try to make it very tangible, which is something that we learned in the COVID context itself. from a perspective of our, let me just see if I can escape this and show that slide. You know, one of the things that both Ethan and I are part of is a project that we started in my lab on pufferfish, which is this um, essentially a full-featured ventilator. And then I just want to mention in terms of the story for what has been very interesting about both the challenge of implementing it and the challenge of thinking about what does it mean to do parallel development. And so when we started the project, of course, we started it in a 3-university consortium across Stanford, University of Utah, and Brown. We released an open source design, which was a preprint that we posted online. And actually, that's how we started the consortium, is when we as a group posted that preprint, and a group at Brown, another set of faculty and students who were working on a similar idea, they reached out to us. We formed a consortium. And the moment we posted it, I think one of the thread that started happening is we realized you can't just finish a product and then just hope somebody would pick that up and it would be deployed in the types of settings that we wanted them to be deployed. And so we started reaching out and we built a broader consortium with manufacturing partners and entities who were thinking about these. And this happened to be a manufacturer in India, which in a traditional context manufactures auto car parts. There was a medical device company in Kenya that was involved in repair of ventilators in the past, but never had actually built a ventilator. And then from Nepal, it was the National Innovation Center, which is known for essentially bringing young people into the context of innovation, but never in the space of medical devices. And although it slowly first started as, of course, both understanding the needs in those places, the premise was that if we all as a community come together, there will be a sense of manufacturing capacity and almost co-development of these sets of products. We've been working on this for the last 6 months. And what I can mention to you was this has been that decision that we made early on to bringing partners from these communities has completely transformed our entire process of how we would even design the product to begin with. And this is not just need finding. I think most often when we think about this, it's like, oh, let me go find the need in my community. But the fact that we were anchored around the idea that we wanted to build, and again, this is still the case if we do succeed, of the first ventilator, an ICU ventilator that could actually be or will be manufactured in the continent of Africa, for example. And that grounding was a difficult one to say because, again, you can always assume that in the context of the pandemic, why are we focusing so much on making sure that on the ground, the ownership of the project actually belongs to these community members? And it was primarily because that once, we have brought the project to wherever it is, it'll have a life of its own, because we wanted these sets of teams to really be able to start businesses around. So the framework that we chose is that the ventilator is completely open source, and I'll just show you all the video of what that actually looks like, which we just posted last night. So if you go to pesglobo.org, this is that consortium that I'm talking about. This is the ventilator. It has all the technical context. This is the entire team. Here are the sets of partners. But the exciting part is here, which is, I think when we started this project, I would have never imagined that in a period of, 4 to 5 months, we would be building a product that is ramping up to kind of ICU needs. But this is the current thing that's going into clinical validation right now. And while you watch this, one of the biggest lesson associated with this was co-development. because there were kind of manufacturing capacities that teams were able to bring in on board, which would have never been possible if we had not partnered really early on. So I think this project has definitely shaped my thinking on when we are really focused on delivering products to people, can we make sure that we do that in a manner that there is a sense of ownership from the very beginning. And especially many of the projects that you all are working on are not academic exercises. They require funds to scale. They require, I mean, some of them are academic questions, but many of the others are really products that we would like people to use around the world. And that requires the logistics side of how will we sustain a product like this in a given market, especially markets that might be very different, might have margins that are very different. I'm just gonna skip to the kind of just to show you guys that the actual ventilator actually works. So anyway, this kind of gives you a perspective. I think I'm very proud of what we were able to do in this short period of time to build a system like this. But now going back to, this would not have been possible if we had not done the kind of framework that we ended up choosing for this specific medical device. And I think the discussion that I want to have around this would be is, I think now, Ethan, would be a good time to now question this premise about the open source side. We learned quite a lot about what does it mean to open source a medical device, because safety is a huge concern in a medical device context. The same thing is true for any of the folks that are working in diagnostics. And so we've been thinking about this as it's an unresolved question so far. And we've been thinking about what frameworks can we build to even answer this question, that just like what the world has transpired in an open source context in both the software industry is built on it, the now slowly many of the environmental kind of things that are coming online are also open source. We've been asking this question, how do you prove and see the landscape for this from a medical context? So Ethan, if you want to share your slide deck on the possible licensing options, or what is the, first of all, this would be a little premiere into just what does it mean when you say that something is open source? And I think think of this as a tutorial to this world. And I know many of you have thought quite a lot about it, are also knowledgeable. So please feel free to ask questions. So Ethan, if you want to share your slide deck now, and then go through some of the technical context of what does it mean to open source a project.
Yeah. So these are some slides I threw together an hour ago. But before we go, I just want to kind of point out, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert. I've just done lots of reading, and you can find these slides. I think let's get those on Notion so you can do whatever you want with them. So licenses are kind of a legal thing. They are documents, and they kind of fall under two different areas of law. One is intellectual property, so that's like copyrights, license, patents, which kind of cover like what can other people do with work that you did. And then the other part that they fall under is contract law. So that's like warranties, liability. If something goes wrong because somebody used your work, can they sue you, or those kinds of things. So that's kind of like where licenses operate in terms of law. And then licenses are also kind of permission for others to use something that you have some kinds of rights under the legal system to restrict them from using. So licenses are about giving other people permission. And then kind of the third way to think about licenses is it's really just one tool in a bigger set of tools that can help support whatever your project strategy is. And then so different projects have different goals and priorities. And then so different kinds of license strategies will make sense for different projects. But most projects have like a few common project goals. One is like not getting sued out of existence by other people, whether it's because somebody like used the thing in a certain way or for whatever other reason. Another project goal that most projects have is like having the work reach people and be used by people and help people. And then a third really common project goal is like being able to have people continue to participate in the project over a long period of time. So there are some financial questions there. There are some social questions there, and so on. And then kind of a fourth common goal is like the project usually wants to receive credit for their work. So this could look like contributors to the project kind of having building a reputation or having something they can point to on their like project portfolio or resume when they're getting hired by somebody or so on. And then these are like project goals that are common to, I would say, probably most projects, businesses, and so on, I would hope. And then kind of there are a few other goals that maybe set open source projects apart. So I'm kind of looking at open source as kind of like what are the goals of this community or this project. Different people have different ways of defining or thinking about what is open source, but I'll just kind of start with a pragmatic way. So one is like usually open source projects want to build a community that will contribute to the work, or to like encourage other people to build on the work that is done by the project, or to encourage other people to like do their own open source projects. So really it's kind of coming down to the community aspect is, for me, what sets open source apart from maybe commercial businesses that are not open source.
Yeah, and I think maybe a comment that I'll make here, which is a little bit of a complication, that often enough, you can actually build successful commercial businesses on open source philosophy. And there are many examples of that in the software industry. It's just less common in the manufacturing. And it is a trickier landscape. And I think once we have gone through the licensing and open source options, I'll bring that discussion back to how do you make something sustainable while still following the philosophy that you want to follow in a given community. And I think it's also important to note that this is not about judging other people and their intentions. It's a very personal decision as well, because of just, these are our personal lives. We are involved in it and the work that you do. So there is nothing, I think there is an ethical thing to think about for as a broader community, because of the lack of medical devices for a broader group of people. If there was a proven strategy that could be reached to broader agencies, then other people will follow as well. But I forgot to mention this. I want you to remember that all of you, for ideas and things that you think about, everybody has the right to be thinking about IP. And frankly, there are many examples in the medical industry in which having an IP has actually allowed a project to scale, which would have died otherwise. So this is not a one button solution. But let's just first understand what options are there, and then we will have that as an open discussion.
Right. Yeah, kind of building on what Manu mentioned about like companies doing open source projects. One big way that they are actually able to like do open source communities with work that they are commercializing is with licenses. So those are kind of setting some terms and mutual agreements about how people will work together, from like business versus individual contributor sides. So open source licenses are basically licenses which override some legal defaults that make, in order to make giving away work safer and easier under certain conditions. So kind of the defaults, at least in the US, is that like there are very low protections from getting sued. So like by default, if there is not a license, then other people are not protected from getting sued by your project for many different kinds of things. And then you also are not protected from getting sued by other people for many different kinds of things. And then so open source licenses are kind of a way that you write one license that applies to everybody and that gives them certain permissions, for example, like making copies or using the work under certain conditions, for example, not suing you or giving you appropriate credit, or in some cases, sharing the work that they do based on your work under the same or a similar license. And so there's like a bunch of different kinds of licenses. But there are two categories. One is kind of permissive, which is kind of like, usually the terms are something like, don't sue me, give me credit, and otherwise do whatever you want. Maybe there's a few other things like, if you make changes, please say what changes you made. And then so this kind of has a long history in the software world. And then open source hardware licenses are a bit newer, but there are like roughly 2 or 3 examples of permissive licenses for hardware. And hardware is kind of a different case because there's various different things that are kind of complicated. So that's kind of permissive licenses. And then reciprocal licenses are kind of defined as like People who use the work that's released under the license need to share the work under either the same license or a similar license. So this is like GPL and other similar things. And then many hardware licenses. There are a few hardware licenses that are kind of in the same spirit also. So a lot of these have like various kinds of legal permissions and then also conditions. And then the question arises of like, how do you enforce it? Usually open source projects enforce licenses just to get people to comply with the licenses. So like if somebody plagiarized your work, then you might email them saying like, hey, please give me credit. And then let's call it a day. Instead of like, I'm going to sue you for plagiarizing me so that I can get money. That's usually not how open source projects do things. And then enforcement is either done by lawsuits, which is probably like out of reach for most community projects, or by community reputation. Like if somebody has plagiarized you, you might kind of write an angry blog post or something and say like, hey, these people seem kind of shady. Why are they not being respectful of my work or whatever? But there's kind of like the reason I mention this is that like you can't just choose a license and say like, okay, this is how our project is going to go. Like even if you have a legal tool, you still need to have a community thing around it that makes the project sustainable, or like has certain protections or has certain community agreements between people involved in the project. The tool itself has to be used in a certain way in order to get anything done.
Yeah, and another way of saying this is also, for example, if you file an IP on an idea, that IP itself is not what protects you. That is just, I mean, you know, anybody could replicate that in a commercial sense or wherever, and then you might learn about it. It's just that gives you then the opportunity to follow suit. And I think around the world, this has been one of the biggest challenge, that because many IP laws are not exactly the same, it's very costly for anybody to even follow through. Eventually, secrecy becomes one of the aspects. And this is really why many a times from commercial scenarios, there is so much secrecy in hardware, because IP by themselves are not a bulletproof option for many commercial entities as well. And the same thing applies for many of these open licenses.
Yeah. And there was a question in the chat about like, what about like if a large company wants to come in and take over a design, then what do you do? And then so this gets challenging. I don't know if there's any good answer for that question, because ultimately it has to be done by like probably by some way of community enforcement of like.
Yeah, I
Maybe it's
think,
like,
I mean,
yeah.
there are a few comments. I know there are several people here from the 3D printing community, and they can comment about historical examples. This has happened over and over again in the 3D printing community and 3D printing manufacturing community, where there are certain designs that were first made open source. There were other entities that became really big. And once the design started in open source, but was taken over and closed at a later time, there are many companies and entities that have gone in on starting in, yeah, so most of the 3D folks already know these sets of stories. And I think the way that I often think about this question is really, what is the goal of starting a project? And if your goal is scale, then certain aspect of engagement is important. And what it allows you to do is to think a little bit about what are the different models that you can directly engage, where the sets of ideas will reach the kind of people you want to reach, but also with certain rules and philosophy that you want to engage. So you might build partnerships that are, if you are leading an open source project, that are conducive to your vision, and you cannot control everything else that will happen around a project as well anyway. And I think this living with that by itself is just something that you have to get used to, that eventually when we share our work openly, there will be other folks who can see differently and might implement. And I think sometimes it's also just about not sweating too much and focusing on what you want to achieve, because as Madhu pointed out, problems are not going away. And it's your role to bring these sets of solutions to the last mile. And in that process, there is so much that needs to be done that since you've been thinking about it, there is enough space. And sometimes you really have to just ask, what do I want to focus my time and energy on as well? So Ethan, let's dive technically into the matrix that you had created. And I think all of this will be publicly open and available, so all of you can read this offline, because this is a very fast-paced just tutorial, but all of these definitions are in place for you to then look over at a later time.
Yeah, so for the pufferfish project, like we were thinking about like, okay, there's so many options for licenses. We have to choose some licenses in order to move forward. So I kind of went in and looked at some of the bigger options and some interesting options. For example, like a human readable license, which is pretty unconventional when most of these licenses are like in very dense legalese that's hard to understand. But these are super experimental. So I was kind of just looking at many options and looking at how do they differ? What are the some of these key conditions that make
Ethan, can you just describe the y-axis and the x-axis? Just
Oh yeah. Good catch. So basically, each row is one license. So for example, here are two different open hardware licenses that kind of require that anyone who builds on your work has to share everything. Approximately, it's complicated because it's hardware. There are some other licenses which are like, okay, as long as you give us attribution, then you can do whatever you want, approximately. There's many software licenses. So I just looked at some which have like somewhat modern things. But yeah. And then I kind of looked at, okay, what are some of their properties? How easy are they to read? Do they have the appropriate patent-related permissions? How popular are they? Do they have requirements on somebody using your work? Does that person have to like share their work under a similar license? What are those requirements? When do they apply? And so on. That's kind of where things get really complicated. And then like other like just links to some of the explanations for why these licenses were made, or frequently asked questions about the licenses. And then I kind of went through these, and at least for the pufferfish project, I looked at like, okay, what are some combinations between hardware and software, since our project is a lot of hardware and a lot of software. So it mattered to us that like they made sense together, and just looked at, okay, like when they get put together, like how do they look?
And I think this is a kind of a domain which is even more complicated because it's hardware plus software plus medical. Yeah. And unfortunately, most times licenses and things are done by example. So if you are in a software space, you just see what is the closest product like this and how did things play out for them. But in the medical space, what we discovered in this work was we just don't have that many examples, which has been really hard. And I think maybe, Ethan, we should talk about because there is a team working on glucose monitoring. Do you have that slide, or should I share that slide? It would be valuable to give that by example of what license was chosen for the
that's
open,
a great point.
Yeah, the open insulin.
I actually don't know what license they use. I would have to look it up.
There might be a few folks in the call who might actually know that. So if you just go to that slide for a second and do So does anybody know on the Open APS what license it was shared on? I know some of you actually use this tool personally as well.
It looks like they use MIT license, which is a software license. Maybe.
Anybody has comments on looked into the licensing for the Open APS as an example? I know we have a Frugal team has been looking in this very deeply. So I don't know if anybody from Frugal's team is online.
Yeah, it looks like maybe Open APS has taken an approach that many open hardware projects have taken, which is just to use a software license. That's not an ideal approach, but it's kind of what the option available was like in around 2010 to 2015-ish.
And I forgot, Ethan, I think maybe, can you just spend a little second on showing what is the product? We have talked about it in private conversation, but just briefly describe the history of this.
Right.
And what happened there that led to pushing on licensing for these types of projects.
Yeah, so this basically comes, my understanding is kind of limited, so please, anybody correct me if I make a mistake. I think so what happened was like there are these medical devices which for people who have type 1 diabetes, and these devices like you wear them and then they can deliver insulin into your bloodstream at like based on certain commands. So that's kind of one piece of the picture. And then the other piece of the picture is there have been medical devices which kind of monitor your blood glucose levels, and then they kind of tell you whether you should deliver insulin. And so what these people did was they like put them together and made it so that the monitor determines how much insulin you're getting. And that's kind of that's something that like is very state of the art. It's like still kind of active research and testing by medical device companies. And the patients with type 1 diabetes are like, we don't want to wait. We can't wait for this because it's just the burden is too difficult to try to like do things the previous way. So they kind of like started a project. Like I think they were working together on Twitter. Like there were people who were kind of building their own solutions, maybe for their kids or for themselves, and then they kind of started working together and came upon a reference design. That's kind of my rough understanding of what happened.
And I think on the medical device space side, because this is not a medical, nobody is manufacturing the medical product comes together by that cable that gets connected. Without it, it's not a medical product per se. And one of the contexts around this has been implementing it for yourself or someone in your family. And I think was one project when we started looking at it to see we truly do need to do research in this space to make sure how do you enable this in the framework of the regulatory bodies. And of course, there's a very clear mandates around, and somebody can actually make a mistake in the control algorithm, and that would lead to an unwanted outcome. And so it's actually extremely important to be thinking about what does the regulatory requirement means for a product like this.
Yeah, so kind of speaking to this question that just came up about DIY open source medical devices. So OpenAPS is a DIY device, which means like the FDA, so the regulatory body in the US says like, because you are making this device only for your own personal use, we don't actually have any say over what happens. But if something goes wrong, please report it to us. So the FDA doesn't actually, they don't control things that are just DIY projects. If you're starting to look at like somebody manufacturing this thing to distribute to other people, that's then where the FDA will have a say and regulatory power. And that's where things are maybe still a bit more unproven. We don't know exactly how to make that work well yet.
Yeah, so just a few more comments on this. And our experience on pufferfish, for example, is, of course, in the context of an emergency, there are EUAs, which are emergency authorizations only. That would apply to the fact that the moment that declared emergency is over, all medical devices that have gotten an EUA suddenly should be recalled back and they should not be used. So this is just the classic thing that's happening around the world right now, that many medical devices are being rolled out with an EUA tag. Of course, the process of having something go through an FDA is a long and an arduous one, but at that same time, it's very, very well documented. And one of the threads associated with this is formally, there is no position that the FDA has that just because a project is open source means that it doesn't qualify. Their criteria is around safety and efficacy of a device, that something is actually needed, it is safe to a level that they can test to, and there is documentation that is at a level where they can assess it to really give them an approval or not. I think one of the challenge sometimes in what is associated with open source projects is, a few sets of people came together, and so there is maybe nobody is committed to the project, which is not true in many ways, but can also be true in the past. So it's much more of a perception around open source. And we've had several conversations in which we had to dispel that perception, which is, again, I think is still a challenge. And then maybe on this FDA front, Ethan, it might be valuable to state one of the hypotheses on the security side that we've been thinking about. Do you want to say a word about the security and safety of devices in the context of open source versus closed? We could talk about that from a pufferfish perspective, for example, or you could just make a comment around this. Our conversation with Ben from Seattle on safety and security and open source in medical device.
Yeah, I think the main thing is that it's like people are worried and they have questions and they're not necessarily proven answers about how you get security and safety in open source. There's just, I think, a lot of uncertainty from like the clinical or the regulatory side. So that's still kind of an open question. Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe what I meant to say was, can you highlight the example that we discussed of the encryption protocols in the security world?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So some of you who might have come from the software world might remember, I think it was in the 2014, 2015, there was this security hole in SSL, which is like one of the key security protocols for the internet, for websites. And I'm looking to see if I had any slides, and maybe I did.
You can just talk about it.
Yeah. And so kind of people were like, so somebody discovered this big flaw that was like present on like a big chunk of all of the world's web servers. And then like afterwards, people were looking at, okay, why did this happen? How did we allow this to happen? And kind of what it ended up being discovered was that like there was a small team of people who were like maintaining this security library that so many different companies were using, and they just were not getting financial support. So they were very short staffed. There was like 1 or 2 people working on the thing, and they, in order to like continue working the project, they had to like bring in like contracts for other things that were unrelated to just maintaining the security of the library. And so there's just this like easy security mistake that like nobody caught because there weren't enough people to look at it. And so what happened afterwards in the open source software world was like companies like Google and other things have kind of committed to like providing financial support, since they make so much money by using this library that they just were not supporting or paying for. And then there were also like some other groups like the Linux Foundation stepped in to say, okay, let's look at what other kind of infrastructure, basic piping of the internet, what other projects are in a similar place where they are used by so many people, they're super important for everybody, and there's not enough support to keep them going. And so that's kind of like one of these challenges with open source projects is like, because we make it easier for other people to do things with their work, then it's easier for them to do things with their work, but not necessarily give back. And that's still kind of the big question with open source is like, how do you ensure that you can keep doing this work and have people giving back or contributing or sustaining the work? Some people are saying, let's use maybe some licenses that are a bit more restrictive. Maybe it's like non-commercial, or you have to share alike. Other people are saying, that shouldn't be how we do things. Personally, I think it kind of has to take community, and I'm not sure exactly yet how we do that, but hopefully we can try out some strategies.
Yeah, and I think this is a good transition, unless people have very specific questions on licensing, and especially we're going to now talk about sustainability of projects per se. But before we do that, I think, Ethan, there was a very specific question. I think you already answered it. It was from Muhammad Abbas. Is there an open source license that put restrictions on work not to be used for profit? I mean, the answer is yes.
Yeah. So if you talk to open source software people about this, it gets very controversial. Some people are very dogmatic about, no, open source should never be not for profit. And then other people are like, we don't care. What we care about is like having different options for different people about what permissions they want to give. So I think in the software world, there are licenses, some of which are kind of experimental, that say like you cannot use this software for profit unless you like get a separate license with us and maybe pay us or something. I think maybe the most well-known example of a license that allows other people to use your work, but only for nonprofit uses, might be the Creative Commons like non-commercial licenses. But those are more for media than for like software or hardware. And then in the hardware world, I don't know of any licenses that restrict commercial uses. So yeah, it's still kind of a new developing area.
Yeah, and then there was a second question. So if you unshare your screen for a second, Ethan, I want to show people on the medical side. Haim asked this question, which is a very important. We worried about this for a while. If you upload an open source medical device, which is still in development, but people try and use it, will the creator be liable? I think this is something that's extremely important to think about in the context of safety of devices as well. So if you just go to the Pufferfish website, for example, I'll show you a language that we built. And again, I'm not saying, again, just like Ethan, I'm also not a lawyer. Although we do have tons of experts we take advice from, when we were building and releasing this tool, it was extremely important to think about making sure that people know and understand that this is not an FDA approved product. There is discussions, but on the other hand, so we wanted to make sure that it could be shared. So there was this permissive license language that we developed with a medical disclaimer that is associated with, I mean, it literally says that people should take responsibility. This is not an FDA approved product. You know, if you're using this content, you're assuming all responsibilities. And if you go in here, this was the language that we developed after extensive discussions, literally, with many teams and people involved, especially in the entities that you work in are also part of this. So it's not just you as a person. Because we are a university, any work that we release brings universities into that fold as well. So there was a special language that was developed for all COVID projects as well. And this is important. Any of you can look through this. And if any of this is useful, you can essentially use this language. So you can see there's an extensive amount of limitations on liabilities and everything that we did put together for this license. Who does this actually apply to? What types of materials does it apply to? And much of this was important primarily because the pandemic has been evolving so quickly. The goal was to be able to support teams, but on the other hand, the implementation, and this is very relevant on who is responsible. So when you think about a manufacturer that really releases a tool, so if some of you are working on a diagnostic side, you can invent a diagnostic tool, you can share it, but there is an entity that will make it and bring it to the market. That could also be you as well. But that sets the expectations that are associated with the regulatory bodies, and those regulatory bodies have to be accounted for locally. So when we are looking at India, Kenya, Nepal, Bangladesh, we are working with regulatory bodies locally to get the appropriate approvals for the entities that are making them. So technically, PES Globo is a consortium, but it is not the distributor or even the owner of the product. What we are releasing is, you can think of it as a reference design. That, and for many, this is an approach that we took because for this, we wanted to give our work away and support people, but we also wanted the entities that are engaging to actually take the liability and responsibility. That if they're engaging in this work, they have to be on top of what the regulatory rules are in their countries. And the model that we are building is that there is a reference design that anybody can participate, but there are manufacturers and partners locally that are passing through all the hoops associated with the clinical and the regulatory framework set up in that country locally. And they are the distributors. Yeah. And multiple people are distributing the same design effectively.
One comment I just want to add. So the license that Manu showed, that was kind of a temporary license that we had custom made while we were choosing our other licenses. I would probably strongly recommend that any project should probably just use a standard license because that kind of gives back to the licenses, helps make those more standard. And also they've already been written by lawyers. That's a very important thing. So like the CERN open hardware licenses, they all come with these disclaimers that basically cover the same thing that our temporary license had said, but it's still legalese, but it's less wordy, and it still has the same amount of protection, I think. That's kind of my understanding. And then kind of going to this question that was just asked in the chat about human readable licenses. This is like a permissive software license. I have not seen a human readable hardware license yet, but like this is probably the minimum and most human readable that you need to get the liability protections while like not being so dense. And basically it says, no contributor to this project is liable for any damages. And then that's kind of all you really need ultimately. But the lawyers are maybe a bit more cautious, and so they'll want to have all this extra language. Yeah.
And then I think related to this comment, there was also a question that was just asked about modularity. We thought quite a lot about modularity in pufferfish, because releasing a reference design, if you really look through this design, there are different modules that anybody can now use. And so the question is, are those modules in any way have specific licenses? And Ethan, I don't know if you want to comment. I think, of course, we had licenses specifically on software and hardware side, but I'm curious, my intuition is that we didn't break it down in further granules beyond that.
Right. I think because our project's goal is to like kind of give away everything, then we were not looking at, is there a core that we might lock down a bit more? Or like, do we want to have an open core and then have some like proprietary things around it? But certainly like the way our project is licensed, we're kind of giving everything away. Then that gives room for other manufacturers to say they're going to design a proprietary module that they won't make open that adds on to this. And permissive license would still be compatible.
Comment about the software libraries. When we were choosing, there was a huge issue around which libraries are compatible with each other.
It was a small issue. There were some software libraries that are GPL licensed. So that means that if any software uses that software, then they also have to be GPL licensed. And we wanted to give our work away more permissively than that. So we just ended up having to not use that software.
So this is another aspect that for any of our projects, if we are choosing to use somebody's work, you have to make sure, even if you are trying to be as open as possible, you have to make sure what you're using is in that same framework as well. Let's see, any other questions on the licenses side of the story? And then I want to transition into an open conversation about how to sustain teams and really focus as individual teams around kind of pushing the work that we are all doing in a direction which moves towards implementation. But any questions on, I'm just curious, actually, maybe the PaperX team, could you say a word about the license that you all put together on the Notion page? Corinne, do you want to comment?
Yeah, that would be really quick. We don't have a license on there yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we need to look into that.
Yeah, but I thought somebody had posted, I'm just curious, as teams, did you internally have some discussions around what framework? I mean, let me just state this in the context of as you work as teams and groups, especially we are internationally, everybody is distributed. It's very valuable as a team, and I do this for every project that we kind of are taking on seriously, beyond kind of ideation, when we are really getting to a point that, okay, there is something here, either as a problem or as a solution, that we have usually discussions internally to make sure everybody is on the same page and is understands or is allowed to pitch in how they are thinking about the IP associated with the sets of ideas and what does that actually mean. So I'm hoping that many of you—
It looks like in the chat there are a few people who have offered.
So let's have folks, so maybe Liz, and then after that, I guess Pat has a comment, and then Fur as well. Yeah, go ahead, Liz.
So I am Liz. I am with the team of the plant antimicrobial discovery. So initially when I put the Notion page, even before we began anything and I brought the idea, I had actually put a, what they call a CC BY. So it's a Creative Commons license. Mm-hmm. And there is actually a website that helps you figure out which type of license can you use? So you just answer questions. So for example, yes, exactly. So when you do choose a license, the way we chose it is that we say we allow adaptations so as long as the others share the same way, and we don't allow for commercial use. So if you look at our Notion page, all of us at the bottom of everything, we put it's called CCBY for NC, and it has like a long term. So we put it everywhere, and the documents that we make. And we had a discussion just this morning about it. And I have brought forward this before, and that is what we use. And we put this in our Notion page, is on the bottom. We just copy and pasted all of that. We just added the non-commercial, although I don't think it's necessary, I guess, but you never know. And that is what we use. And I brought that because I had seen, I'm an informal educator. So when we make curriculum and we make hands-on activities, we try to do open resource, and most of the stuff I've done is under Creative Commons. So that allows teachers to use it, make copies, reproduce it, send it by email, and also remix so they can edit things. So as long as nobody sells it for a profit, and it has worked pretty well. But yes, we thought about this very early on.
Yeah, and I think, Liz, I want to emphasize this point, and the reason I wanted to spend a whole class on discussing licenses, and just the idea that you should all think about these types of things early on in a project as well. It's also very important for the cohesion in the team itself. So let's transition to a few comments I want to make about what is the vision here and what are we trying to achieve. As people come together and work together around common goals, it's very important that, and again, this is not pertaining an entire class. I'm just talking very specifically about project teams. When people work together, and Emmanuel and I work on several things together, and there is a sense of getting to know the individuals you're working with, and there is a sense of common trust. And that is extremely important for a project, especially there is a common trust, there is respect, and there is a sense of where you feel comfortable in sharing both the sets of challenges that you face and the sets of praises that you might have for the individuals that are contributing, and have a very open communication. And many of those things boil down to making sure that you are all coming on the same platform. And if people's perception about a project are different, and again, these licensing discussions early on and what vision you want the project to have, if they are different, it's perfectly okay, except it becomes harder and harder for people to work together as time passes by. And often enough, when people are really invested in a project and a lot of time has passed, and then they learn that, we're not really on the same page, it really is much tougher. And many ideas die, not because they were not good ideas, but people couldn't come together to agree on how they should be implemented. And the social and the human aspect of teams, when I'm thinking about a project, the most important component is the team that we're trying to build. Nothing else matters. If the group of people that are coming together are the right kind of people, and you have to be very honest with yourself. You can work with somebody and you could say, oh, maybe for a quarter or a semester, I can bear working with this person, but no, not for a long term. And again, these are personal things. You have to make sure that you're listening to your gut as well, but make sure that these types of discussions don't actually disrupt, primarily because of the sets of challenges that we're trying to build and solve for already don't have market-driven solutions. If market was the primary criteria that these things could work so easily, then many of these problems could have already been solved. So it even is more important for you to be thinking about these sets of ideas. I don't know, Emmanuel or anybody else who wants to share lessons around the sense of Emmanuel builds very large-scale teams around oceanography projects. And I'm curious, Emmanuel, what are your criterias? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I know you would definitely have a lot to say in this front. What are your criterias on building teams?
Exactly what you said is first respect. So we each carry with us our reputation, and your reputation is your largest resource. I mean, this is who you are and how people perceive who you are, and that is with you forever. And I mean, forever, as long as you live, or as long as you're professionally active. And it's really important
Actually,
that
your reputation even goes on when you're in your graveyard.
Yeah, but then you don't care about it anymore. So, and you can lose it really fast by being a jerk or by being perceived to be a jerk. And so it's really, really important that you're honest and you talk about everything. Anytime you're uncomfortable, anytime you feel that somebody's, and I mean, the teams I like to play with are people who are like-minded. They're willing to say in your face exactly what annoys them. They don't build it up and then it explodes. And they're sharing. I mean, I love to play with people that shares. And now Manu and I are very lucky. We have the financial backing of working in a job that pays all the bills. And it's totally understandable that some of you are not, and some of you would like to make a living out of what you're doing. So this can be said. You can say, you know, I really want to join this team, but I need some support. And that's normal. Then you join the team and there's support put aside for you, recognizing the fact that each of us has needs and wants, but as long as it's on the table, it's much easier to discuss it and be part of the issue. So
yeah, and I think what Emmanuel just raised here on the support side is very important, which is what I wanted to make sure that for projects to really succeed, if you don't account for the human need that we all have, just you have to put food on the table and other factors. And this is also why when you're structuring a project for it to be sustainable, you have to come up with you're solving several aspects of the puzzle. And this is why you should be thinking on the longer term. Sometimes it's very valuable to have a very broad mind around. There's no one approach that applies, because when we do certain sets of projects, certain ideas can get support much more easily than other ideas, because you might be fighting against a dogma in a field that just is extremely hard to break, and then you can't really get funding. I know there was one more comment. If anybody wants to make comments on this, would be a good way of saying a few words about folks who have worked in teams and have had lessons that they might want to share. Because then after that, I want to jump and make a few comments about funding and support. Sheetal had a question. I don't know if anybody else first wants to share any other lessons on teams that they work with and succeeded throughout, sort of positive examples. There are lots of negative examples on what doesn't work. We don't have to spend time on it. Okay, so let's transition the discussion on support and funding, which Emmanuel rightly brought up. My vision for many of the projects that we're all initiating is, as you can see, I'm hoping for us to be extremely open, and in our openness, we will allow these projects to succeed. And this is why the idea board that we created, my proposal, if everybody's going to agree, is to make that publicly available on the website. And all the Notion pages for your projects, unless you share with me that there is a reason that we would prefer not to have our Notion page be anywhere openly available, that's actually okay with me. But it would be valuable to discuss that. And I can just tell you from my experience working in the last 10 years in this field, being open, there are more benefits of being open than there are of being closed. But having said that, I think these are individual decisions. The other aspect that somebody brought up, I think it was Yves or folks, about making sure that in your teams, if you want the team to survive, make sure you give credit where the credit is due. Ideas come in conversations, and it's extremely important to be responsive to this notion on agreeing and sharing and reminding yourself over and over again what is the origin story sometimes. And these origin stories are actually important because it gives people the sense of And doing that continuously, even in your own team, will help people both understand. And again, the origins are important, the implementers are important, the deployers are important, the folks who are really bringing a question to you, all aspects are crucial. So we have to make sure that in your internal team dynamics, so unless, folks should internally think about this as well and get back to me on the Notion pages. The next step that comes along really is, it's valuable also to think about when is the right time to make sure a certain resources are put in a project. Some of that can depend on just, you can only work on a project when you can have certain resources on the table. My principle and idea on that often enough, and again, I, as Emmanuel said, I'm privileged because my salary is covered, so I can just think about whatever I want to think about. I often try to get a project to a point where I am myself convinced that that approach is going to work. Because sometimes when you're then thinking about trying to convince others to get resources, if you're not convinced yourself, trust me, it's going to be very hard to convince somebody who's holding funds to say that, and it is not about completing the project. It is not about having a prototype or even a device or something or demonstration. All of those are good. It is about having a very solid, convincing argument. I mean, of course, the need is something that we've spent a lot of time on, but the presentations that you're all about to make, that is the one criteria you should be thinking about. That are you yourself convinced? It's not also about feasibility, comes at a slightly later point, but make sure that you are applying that critical lens on your project to say, is this approach the right approach for the scale we are interested in? And this is what is different in frugal science. There are many ventilators that are out there, and if our goal was $50,000 ventilator, we would design it completely differently. But you have to, if you don't put that scale criteria in your, and again, this is what I'm going to be pushing all of you on when you're be presenting, is to make sure that can you grapple with the idea of the scale of the problem. And again, it doesn't mean that you should stop working. It just means that you have to think more about that, because once you start building a team and have certain sets of resources, and it's very hard to take U-turn. So in terms of thinking about the funding aspects, and also just as you're thinking about these sets of projects, there is a renewed, I mean, of course, first of all, there is a possibility that science, at least in the US context, might again be on the table. So my hope is that things are going to change in the US landscape as well. But funding is a lot about storytelling as well. And I think this is another skill that you will all have to learn along the way as you're thinking, that it is not the brilliance of an idea, but your capacity to really share an honest story. And I think all of you have done a very good job as thinking about these sets of projects. And in your videos that you're all creating, you have to think a little bit about this early on. And effectively, the folks that would be, be willing to put a resource on a project. And again, for all community projects, certain sets of resources are actually necessary. So this is another skill that many of you can pick up along the way and use that as an example. Because without that narrative, it becomes very difficult. It is not just a technical achievement that gets supported, although it might be because of the technical achievement that you might be able to do what you're proposing. Yeah, I'm curious, other sets of questions and threads that people might have in this space, and especially on examples associated with community projects that have actually struggled because these sets of thoughts were, like, I'm always curious. For example, I go to many maker spaces, and maybe Leo, you could comment on this a little bit. Many maker spaces are really successful communities, while others are not. And I'm curious, in your journey, did you learn, what were the key lessons that made them sustainable? I mean, it's not just about charging fees. So where was the balance? I'm curious, is there anything to learn from funding and sustainability of a makerspace, for example?
think the economic model for makerspaces can be challenging. The ones that tended to be sustainable were makerspaces that were grown rather than makerspaces.
Sorry, I think we can't hear you very well.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, much better.
Can you hear me? All right. Well, you can't see me, but
No, it's okay. We want to hear you. You is lower priority.
Yeah. So what I was saying was that it's a tough economic model for makerspaces, but the ones that tended to be sustainable were grown instead of just being placed there. So typically they had the most stewardship from their community, and generally they started, I would classify them kind of as like hacker spaces maybe, but they had this strong buy-in from people, and like everyone using the space it was something they kind of wanted for themselves, and so they had this initiative to like help create it, and those tended to last. And there were a lot of maker spaces where like some organizations came in and just said, okay, we're just gonna throw some money down for these reasons because it's going to be innovative and whatnot, but there wasn't a lot of buy-in, and then they would also invest like in the equipment but not enough in the people.
Yeah, I think this equipment versus people is a very important. We think it's the equipment but it's really the people that matter far more than the equipment. And this is also the premise of frugal science in some sense. You might think that you could do your best work only when you have the most well-funded and the most equipped lab space, while the reality is that you need to have well-fed people who have the time and the mental capacity to have empathy for the problem you care about.
Yeah. And I would also draw a parallel, so I also do open source projects, software development, and some hardware too. And I've made some maker spaces in the past, and like the model of creating them, the ones that are successful, there's a commonality that the sooner that you involve other people, the better chance it has of being successful. So like if I try to sit in my room and engineer like the perfect program that I think people are gonna love, then most of the time no one else ever uses it. But if I just like see that, if I'm doing a workshop or something and find that there's a need for this like one specific thing and make it with the people there, those tend to grow better and then sustain themselves later. And that was true about like spaces that I've made in the past too, that like if I tried to get a grant to create a space, then that often didn't work as well as just like getting some friends together and just finding whatever tools we had and putting them in some closet that we, could hide away in, with or without permission, maybe.
I know Rishi had a question. Rishi, do you want to just ask that question?
Yeah. Some part of this team out back now called Proper Plotter. We are looking at biomaterials and trying to come up with a way to kind of collate, curate publicly available data, because we are not in a position to do some many measurements ourselves. But since we are kind of heavily dependent on what is available on the internet and published articles, and since this is kind of a curation effort, and so one question I had was, are we kind of stepping into like copyright or kind of IP kind of landscape where it could be like a trademark kind of values could be, are they trademarked? Other thing is, since we are making it available and hope to kind of come together in such a way that we would want to engage with institutions or corporations in a more open innovation kind of model. So in that sense, what keeps me awake is like, are we ending up in a landmine when it comes to using publicly available data?
Yeah, no, Rishi, this is very simple. Publicly available data is publicly available data. And you are building a website on top of a publicly available data. As long as you are citing it to make sure that the source and the origin, by definition, as long as the data is cited, that is all the credit that you need to give. If somebody made the measurement, they made it publicly available in a published paper, for example, as long as you cite the paper, you don't have to worry about with the thing. You're not creating that specific material, the IP, say if I create a magic biomaterial that is as good as plastic, anybody who created this want that information to be out there. The IP is in the creation of that material, and that might be trademarked. There might be a secret that might actually have a patent on it. But the fact that you create an online tool that you put, here is the material properties I want, give me 10 biomaterials that actually demonstrate that property. That is absolutely no issues around anything associated with any copyrights or anything. As long as it's publicly available, you are okay.
Okay, it's just a quick follow-up question. And sometimes like companies do use like publishing it as like a more of a defensive ploy, so that it kind of says it's out there, and then they have their elaborate way they build up their own, trademark or copyright behind it. So it's publicly available, and we are good, and there's no harm in kind of curating and just making it
curating data. As long as data sources are cited, I don't see any issues around this. I mean, I think we can have a more detailed discussion on this for the specific you're thinking about, but I mean, other people can comment, maybe Emmanuel, on any of the government datas or anything that you've used in the past. Have there been an example of an issue on curation of data? I mean, sometimes it even comes from private locations, and you can still make portions of that available as long as you've had a conversation around who owns that data.
Yeah, I've never encountered a problem, never.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so what we'll do is just in the last 2 minutes, I just want to briefly mention, I just want to remind everybody, this is not the end of the class. This is just the end of formal lectures. There is so much more that we all have to talk about, but I would much rather do that in the context of the teams. And I want to emphasize, the only outcome that we can be happy with ourselves is really when we start moving. It doesn't matter if all the projects where they are move to the next stage, but it's most important that you're all looking at the sets of projects and saying, let's really turn that into deliverables and solutions to people. That is really the heart of why we started all of this. Often enough, a class has what you get out of it is a grade. There is, I know for Stanford folks, I have to give a grade. There is no grade other than the fact that this is a really joyful ride with all of you, and the ride will continue. And I just want to focus on the projects, because this is really the beginning of these projects. As you will learn, even in the directions that we have taken on projects will steer in many places. And of course, some of you will have different kinds of bandwidths involved. Make sure that you communicate that with your teams as well. And then so first of all, I'll put open office hours. Anybody who wants to connect starting 10 p.m. tonight, I'll kind of put 2 hours or so for people who want to do last minute chats before the talks next week. And then after we have done presentations from different teams, we will sort of do one-on-one discussions with every team as well, to coming up with the strategy for sustainability of that project. So I think this is how I'm thinking, but it would be valuable for you to use this current week intensely to make sure that you're making the best pitch associated with where you currently stand, and also make sure everybody in the team or in the overall class has learned as much as you have learned about that project itself. And then the big thing that I'll be reading through would be all the mentors and everybody will be the Notion pages. So make sure that you document that somebody else who comes along and wants to follow up and join has a good starting point. So the Notion page is really what you should be focusing on. It's perfectly okay to have an okay video, but a very good Notion page rather than the other way around. Okay, I think we will see you all next week. Do you know, Tyler, if we have a deadline for people to be, it's always with things like this, it helps to have a deadline. Is there a deadline for people to drop the videos so we can all start watching them?
Oh, interesting. Okay. Okay, so last time I think we had said that the deadline for videos was at the beginning of class on Thursday. But I do know that some teams are going to be presenting and doing the little discussion on Tuesday. So
that's
whatever
okay.
you think.
Yeah, I think we could keep that on Thursday. I think it's useful if you have a video, you put that on as soon as possible. So during the discussion, you can assume that people might have watched the video. At least I would go and watch the videos beforehand so that we focus the discussions around the sets of challenges that you're trying to solve.
I think that sounds good. And also, Manu, thoughts on maybe they can do either way with the videos, but maybe on the Notion page, they can just try to put together a decent looking Notion page by Tuesday so we can take a look, or as good as they can, by then.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's not the visuals, it's just really the depth. It can be it's your lab notebook. I think the goal is to just share your lab notebook internally with groups. Corinne, you had a question.
And I'll, in the announcements chat of Discord, I'll post the link to deposit the videos. So no worries there.
Yeah, I had a question on creating the video. I know it's possible for one of us to do it. There's so many tools out there, but then I put a really heavy load on one person. So can we just record a Zoom?
Do a Zoom. You guys could just do a talk basically, and all of you can be talking, and whichever
Maybe
way.
share the Notion pages as we're talking.
Yeah, walk through the documentation, just have one person clearly state the sets of ideas first. And then once that has been done, then you can just transition to just the content that's been created. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
And it's also about being a little bit concise as well in the video. I think, you should create like a 10-minute video, I would say. Yeah. But, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be 10. It's 10-ish minutes. Yeah. Okay, I'll see you all on Tuesday. Bye, everybody. And then I'll have office hours tonight. So if people want to connect, starting 10 p.m.